So imagine, it's Russia. You're in a village. It's 30 years, something like that, after the serfs have been emancipated. There's a few
Emancipated is a little
who
strong.
manage to produce successful agricultural enterprises. And, maybe they have a couple of cows, they have some land, they're able to hire a few people, and they're raising almost all the food, right? And they're a minority in any village because the hyper-productive, successful are always a minority. So they're a minority in every village. All right, and there's people who are doing worse, and then there's a lot of people who aren't doing so well at all. And then the communist intellectuals show up and they tell the people who aren't doing so well, some of whom are just suffering because of life, but some of whom aren't doing well because they've never done anything productive with even a second.
Wait, we're talking about the recently emancipated illiterate serfs who have lazing around, not doing anything productive with their lives? Okay.
Their life. And the communist intellectuals come in and say, those guys that are doing so much better than you? Yeah, they actually stole all of that from you. And you're morally obligated to go take it back. It's like, oh man, after 6 cups of mead, let's say 10, or let's say 20, and I'm drunk out of my mind, and I've got my cruel...
This is a very interesting picture that we're painting of the violent, angry, drunken serf going to get revenge on the more successful peasant.
Buddies with me, and we're all resentful right to the core because we've wasted our miserable lives, and now we have an opportunity.
They're resentful. Are we trying? We're trying to impose the people people who aren't doing well under capitalism are resentful of people who do well narrative onto the quote recently emancipated feudal peasantry. I mean, it's a very evocative scene that we're painting here.
To go down the street to our wealthy neighbor's house and to rape his daughters, and we can do it in the name of good. It's like, well, there's a story you can market. And that happened everywhere in the Soviet Union. And so they wiped out the kulaks. It's like...
Very, very evocative, not particularly explanatory. Some people were doing well, some people were doing poorly. Oh God, were the people doing poorly angry because they'd wasted their lives. And then the kulaks were wiped out. Unclear what exactly were the social and economic and political, machinations that led to that. But, I mean, we know it has something to do with the resentment of the unfortunate masses.
Right, and then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death.
Yeah, that's right.
Brilliant.
Wait, what is the... And then 6 million from the famine imposed by the government? What does that have to do with... What does that have to do with the resentful peasants?
Brilliant.
I'm a farmer.
Brilliant.
The Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. Mm-hmm. Then it became a region pathetically unable to feed itself.
We've just completely jumped topics.
And yet, the same sort of worldview that gave rise to that, we're now being told, you use the word neo-Marxist. Many people in Australia use the word cultural Marxist. I've got an old...
Wait, the worldview that gave rise to the murder of the kulaks, or that gave rise to the Holodomor?
And who said to me, what are you talking about, John? Free capitalist Australia is not going to let that happen here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Qantas Airlines took a nice step towards that
happened?
The other day. And they adopted their language policing policies, these corporate...
Here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Qantas Airlines took a nice step towards that the other day. And they adopted their language policing policies, these corporations who should know far better let these far left fifth columns into their organization.
Okay, I'll assume we're talking about a corporation adopting a hate speech policy or something along those lines. This is an example of a step towards the Holodomor, and a step towards peasants murdering the wealthier peasants because of propaganda from the authoritarian government. I feel like we've just jumped topics again, but...
They think they're not going to pay for that. They think they're going to stop with some demands for the reconstruction of language, not like the demands for reconstruction of language, by the way, are trivial.
What are we...
They're maybe the most important thing you could possibly demand, right? I
what
want
do we
to
mean by
the way you speak. I want to reshape the way you think.
Wait, are we talking about a hate speech policy? Is this going to be about the gender pronouns? Or what do we mean by reconstruction of language?
It's like, well, that's okay, as long as it doesn't interfere with the bottom line. It's like, it'll interfere with the bottom line. You let that fifth column in. It's a warning to corporate people. You let that fifth column in, man, you're going to regret it. You're going to regret it.
He's such an interesting speaker. I mean, it seems incredibly well crafted to elicit the correct emotional response. I mean, obviously for me, it's like a little bit terrifying the way he speaks, but I could imagine if I were inclined differently, like this could be incredibly moving. But like nothing that he's saying, there's no like logical thread to any of it. And none of the topics that we've touched on have any clear connection to one another.
So, and things can turn on a dime, a very well-organized minority, even if the majority opposes them, and they do. A very well-organized minority can have an unbelievably pernicious effect on an organization.
You mean like the Republican Party and the religious right?
Margaret Mead's made that point.
Well,
Society's changed direction when a small group of people decide to change its direction. That's the way history works.
Well, that's what happened in the universities.
Let's come back.
Just completely another new topic.
This issue of the redefining of language.
Universities.
It seems to me that there are two things that people who want to reshape society in brutal ways do. The first is they start to silence good debate, either silence it or shut it down or whatever. Second thing they do is they redefine language so it's very hard to have a debate. So diversity, actually, I mean, there's no other way to put it. In this country, it's rapidly coming to mean a stifling conformity. You dare not deviate from.
This is an interesting thing that this is an interesting argument that people make. I mean, especially conservatives, because conservatives have a perpetual victim complex, but I imagine everybody does this. When a group starts to employ a concept or point out a phenomenon that they're resistant to, rather than say, I don't like that we're talking about this or that concept, or that we're pointing out this or that phenomenon, because I would rather we not talk about things like diversity or whatever, they'll say that the language is being redefined. It's this kind of deferral of responsibility from like the ideas to a kind of like, well, you're playing dirty by changing the meanings of the words that stand for those ideas. It's like kind of a dead end. It's kind of a dead end argument because you can't really, like, there's no real way to argue with it. Like there's no objective meaning to any particular word. It's just whatever. Like words are just meant to help us communicate our ideas to one another. But like I don't know exactly how we respond to this redefining the words point that people bring up. I feel like people on the left do this too. I don't know.
On the line. And you see it with a whole lot of other words that are bandied around, equality being one of them.
Yeah.
Because it's confused. Equality of opportunity is confused with equality of outcome.
Well, the initial wedge was equality of opportunity. And then
so if you have a particular idea of what equality of opportunity should mean, for instance, that the government doesn't explicitly discriminate against people, and that's where you think we should stop in terms of instituting equality. And then some other people say, well, actually, maybe if we're still getting unequal outcomes, maybe we didn't really have equality of opportunity. Maybe we need more proactive efforts to make, people more equal in certain ways. Like that's the debate. But this is being framed as sort of subversives redefining the meaning of the word equality from what it ought to have meant to something that it can't mean. I don't know what we're trying to evoke here. Like, I wish we could just have the actual debate over like what steps we should take to guarantee like human equality.
Flew, and so, well, no, it's equality of outcome. That's equity, and that's, I cannot believe how rapidly that idea, which is the ultimate and terrible ideas. I can't.
Or are we
believe
off of the
how
redefining
rapidly
thing?
That spread,
redefining
and how
words
little
point.
People criticize it. Well, That's because to uninformed analysis, it sounds good if you're feeling carelessly compassionate.
Because you go back to the...
It's incredible. I mean, obviously they must, have some reference point for what they think they're talking about that, anyone just watching the interview isn't necessarily going to have. But I'm amazed by how unspecific all of this conversation has been. I mean, there have been examples, obviously, but the examples didn't really connect to one another, and they didn't really connect to any overarching, clear, logical argument. But I mean, it is very emotionally evocative.
Ukrainian example, in destroying the leading edge farmers, you actually guaranteed misery for everyone.
Oh, unbelievable. People were selling.
They're jumping around so much
for food. It was, if you were a mother and your children were starving and you went out into the fields after they were harvested and you picked up individual pieces of grain that the harvesters had left and you didn't turn them over to the state, that was a capital offense.
What does this have to do with...
That was...
What does this have to do with Australia?
The funny thing is, that was in the glory days of the Russian Revolution, right? That wasn't in the 1950s. That wasn't in the 1930s even. That was in the 1920s. That was right when this started. And I think it was Malcolm Muggeridge who was reporting on that for a UK newspaper whose name escapes me at the moment. He was pointing all of this out, and no one paid attention to it.
No one paid attention. Towards the end of his life, he warned that the West is in danger of eating itself out from within. And I wonder whether, in fact, he wasn't being very prescient. And you and I want to stop that happening for the sake of our young people, as much as anything else, for the sake of everyone.
We went down that pathway already.
Which pathway?
We tried it. History should be like science in the sense that it ought to be objective. It ought to be told truthfully. It ought not to be used to secure some dominant group's preferred version.
But that's pretty... I don't have to point out how ironic that statement is coming from these guys, right?
Of society.
Well, this is also why, what I've been trying to do about this, because I thought this through a long time ago. I thought, well, I think the group identity game ends in blood. Doesn't matter who plays it. Left-wingers play it, blood. Right-wingers play it, blood. And lots of it, not just a little bit.
I don't necessarily disagree with a version of that claim. I mean, what does end in blood mean? Is ending in blood necessarily bad? Are all forms of violence always bad? What are we talking about?
The identity politics game. Well, so what do you do instead? You live the mythologically heroic life as an individual. That's the right
Is this conversation meant to refer back to some source where all of these points are elaborated on? Isn't the problem that I'm watching a clip?
Message of the West, as far as I'm concerned, is that we figured that out. We figured out that the collective identity was not the pinnacle statement. That the individual, not that collective identities have no value, obviously.
The West, we in the West figured out that collective identity doesn't matter or something. You just said, is the West not a collective identity then? What are we talking about?
Family has value and your organizations have value, all of that. That's not the issue.
Yeah.
The issue is, what's the paramount value? What's the metric by which people should be measured? And the answer is, they should be measured as individuals.
Okay.
As if they have a divine soul. They should be measured in that manner.
They can be measured as individuals even if they don't have a divine soul.
But it can't be a selfish thing. That is to say, if I recognise I have worth and dignity, I'm obliged to recognise that so do you.
Mm-hmm. I think you can't recognise that you have intrinsic worth and dignity without also recognizing it in others. And
I would probably agree with that. I don't know if these guys recognize the inherent worth and dignity of other people very much, but
I don't think that I can recognize the worth of another person without stumbling onto the idea that I also have to recognize that for myself. When did you think, well, everyone would want that, but people don't, because you're also charged with the responsibility of your own care, as if you matter. Well, that's a big responsibility. It's a lot easier to assume that everything is pointless. I mean, that's painful and all of that, but well, you don't bear any responsibility then.
And no one lives that way.
No, well, not for long.
Not for long. Well, not for long, exactly. But you know, Voltaire's biographer, it wasn't actually Voltaire himself, it was a lady who wrote one of the many biographies of him in the 1930s, came up with that adage summarising his views, that I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Okay,
There's a couple of things implicit
jump topic
in that
again
that seem to be
completely.
incredibly important. So I may disagree with you, but you have dignity and standing and worth and a right to put your view. That's the first thing. I'm respecting the other person.
Oh, you should crave it.
Yeah. And the second thing it implies is that it's the idea on the table that's important for two reasons. One is we need to have a debate about that, not attack the person who put it there, show some respectful. The second thing is it's only by honest debate that you find the best way forward.
Well, that's the thing. That ties back to the discussion we had about the purpose of memory and the purpose of historical education. It's like, look, there's another rule in my book, which is Rule 9. Assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't. Well, they do. The person you're listening to knows some things you don't. You can
This is something he has never believed.
be sure of that. Now, whether or not you can get to them is a different matter, but if you do get to them, it's a real deal for you. That's why you want to listen to the other person's arguments, is because you're not everything you could be. You don't know the pathway forward with as much clarity as you could. And it's possible. This is one of the wonderful things that I've had the privilege of experiencing as a clinician. Because people, it's like I live inside a Dostoevsky novel as a clinician. People come in and they tell me about their lives, and I listen to them, and they tell me things that are just absolutely beyond belief, And I learn from my clients constantly. They're telling me honestly about their experience. They tell me things they wouldn't tell anyone else because I actually listen to them. But part of the reason I listen is because I'm desperate to listen. It's like there's a possibility I'm going to do something stupid in the next 5 years that's going to be like fatal. And there's some small possibility that if we have a decent discussion, that you'll tell me something that will eliminate some of my blindness.
Wait, are we on this because of like the defend to death your right to say it? And then Peterson was like, yes, dialogue. When I am in a session with my patients, it's important that I listen to what they're saying, and this ties into dialogue. And then we're probably going to jump to a point about how the left doesn't value dialogue, and probably they wouldn't listen to what their clients have to say. They would just see them as members of groups. I mean, I don't know. This is my thesis of this video, is that this is just incredibly all over the place. I feel like they have something that they mean in their heads that they're trying to say, but maybe if they formulated it into an actual logical argument, they would realize it didn't really hold up. So we have to just kind of like throw out like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? I don't think the left believes this. They don't recognize our profundities. I don't know. Okay.
So that I don't have to fall into that particular pit. And if you have a good sensitivity for the depth of the pit, then you're pretty bloody motivated to avoid it. And so that dialogue is it's dialogic, it's dialogos, right? It's shared logos. It's the way that we redeem ourselves mutually.
Yes,
moving
that's
forward.
the root of the word dialogue.
All depends on having the facts on the table as best you're able to establish them, not distortions of fact.
Not what you wish would be the case. At least your
Yes.
best approximation of what
Having
you think
good
to be true,
dialogue
and not what you wish for.
That's productive, requires
Because
facts.
the new version of this seems to be, if I disagree with what you say, I'll paint it as
Again,
hate.
this is not something either of these people do. It's entirely just what they want to believe to be the case that they discuss. But have we even mentioned any facts in this conversation? We've mentioned like stories, like very like emotionally loaded stories. I don't know if we've mentioned any facts.
Speech or challenging to my notions of diversity and inclusiveness,
Yes, right, sure.
and I'll fight to the death your right to even have your say.
Well, that's why hate speech laws are so pernicious. It's like,
What?
and that needs to be taken apart. First
Wait,
question.
but didn't he just say that like he was going to defend the right of the people to employ their concepts of diversity, and then okay, I don't know, how does this relate to hate speech laws?
Is there such a thing as hate speech?
Well, sure.
Yes, obviously.
Yes, okay.
People say terrible things, reprehensible things,
Okay.
quasi-criminal things even, all the time. Brutal, and some of them cause a lot of trouble. So the idea that there's hateful speech, it's like, yeah, okay, that's self-evident, no problem.
So
Well-
yes, the answer was yes, there is a such thing as hate speech.
Let's regulate
Not
it.
everyone would agree with that, by the way.
Okay, fair enough, because it's hateful. Maybe we'd rather that there wasn't any of it. Okay.
Well, no, we'd rather that it not be in particular settings, and where institutions have the ability to regulate it, they probably should.
No problem. Who defines hate? Well, we'll worry about that later.
Wait, I thought we said that there was a such thing as hate speech. Wait, what do you mean, who defines hate? Like, who defines hate? The institutions, the public, everyone who defines anything?
It's like, no, you won't.
Disparaging people based on intrinsic qualities of their humanity? Like, how about that for a definition?
That's actually the problem. Here's the answer to who defines hate. Those people that you would least want to have define it. That will be the inevitable consequence of the
How?
legislation.
Based on what?
Because sensible people won't have anything to do with that.
We were so close to an actual argument that was leading towards hate speech does exist and we can regulate it, and then we've just steered, like, we've just driven the car into a wall.
People who are power mad will gravitate to that domain to make an ethical case to exercise their controlling power over the language of other people. No, and I've had journalists say, what makes you think that your right to free speech trumps the right of someone to not be offended? And I think that's really the level of our political discourse. Okay, so we'll run a little...
Is hate speech okay? Does it not exist? Does it exist, but malevolent people are going to abuse it or abuse the concept in order to ban it? Which is the argument that we're making? There's no...
thought experiment. So I'm talking to one person, I'm talking to you, and the rule is I don't get to offend you. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe we can still have a discussion about something difficult. But let's say I'm talking to 10 people and about an important thing. Now I have to make sure that I don't say anything, despite the fact that this is an important and contentious issue, that I don't say anything that offends even one of those 10.
No, that you don't say anything that disparages people based on intrinsic characteristics of their humanity, that doesn't become exponentially harder to do the more people you have in the room. I mean, maybe it becomes harder, but if you're just not going to say hateful things in the first place, it's not going to be much of a difference. One person, two people, three people.
Okay, maybe I can even manage that.
Yeah,
what
maybe.
If I'm talking to 1,000 people?
When are you talking to 1,000?
Be someone
I guess if you're like,
1,000 people,
if you're on the internet,
there's going to be someone who's offended at the mere fact that I exist.
No, it's not about whether somebody's offended. It's about whether you use hate speech. You can be offended by somebody's stupidity. Like the stupidity of this conversation offends me. But
so it's an impossible standard. It's like, well, you can't say anything offensive. Okay, fine. Then you can't say anything.
no,
Okay.
No, you can say things that are offensive. You conceded that there was a such thing as hate speech. What are we talking about?
So what? You don't get to say anything because no one should be offended. Well, then you don't get to think. Well, what happens if you don't think? Well, then you can't negotiate your way through the future.
This is like catastrophizing logic, because the connection between like each point and the next point is very, very tenuous. But like we're still running down the line of, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? And what if this happens? And then you were not allowed to think.
And you fall into a pit, and so does everyone else.
What? So does everyone else?
That's where that all ends up. You can't say offensive.
And then the world blows up because everyone fell into the pit. And what are you going to do about that?
Of things. Equals, you cannot negotiate your way properly through the future. Equals, everyone suffers.
He's very good at using tone shifts effectively. I wish I could become this good at rhetoric, but I feel like it's like inherently like sophistic, yeah. Like it's inherently to use sophistry to speak in this way.
That's a bad strategy.
This video started off being about the murder of the kulaks and like the fact that serfs, the freed serfs who were quote unquote freed, were angry and resentful. And now it is really just about like, I wish I can, I want to be able to use hate speech. Why can't we say, I don't know, why can't we like, you know, use, I don't know, homophobic language? That's what this ultimately is about, right? This is where we're ultimately going. We went from the Soviet Union was bad to I want to be able to say slurs. Is that all these people care about?
Thank you for watching this episode.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. That was